What is frequency? Frequency is how often something happens. In our case, how often this sound wave repeats. The higher the note you play on a keyboard, the greater the frequency. So what happens if we double our frequency? We can see that here. I'll explain what I'm doing later, but for now focus on how the sound wave changes. When I move this up, the frequency of whatever note I'm playing is added to itself. So the first time I do it, the frequency is doubled, and it sounds like this. This is called an octave. An octave is a type of interval, and an interval is simply the distance between musical notes or the difference of their frequencies. If you play a musical instrument, you'll know that there are traditionally only 12 different notes you can play, or 12 different intervals within an octave. The smallest interval is referred to as a semitone, sometimes also called a half step. You can see this visually on a keyboard. After 12 notes, or an octave, the pattern repeats. To differentiate between octaves, we use numbers. For example, this is C3, and this is C4. In Vital, whatever note I play on my keyboard or MIDI controller determines the frequency of our sound. But we can change that in Vital with this control. We can add semitones to increase the frequency or subtract them to lower the frequency. So let's say I'm playing C3 on my keyboard, but I want my sound to play C4. I add plus 12 here, and now my frequency is doubled. This is where we control pitch, another word for frequency. We usually use the word pitch when referring to music notes like C3 or C4. Frequency is measured in hertz, which is cycles per second. For example, A4 is a pitch or a note, and 440 hertz is its frequency. We can also change pitch in a more subtle way. This control here lets us adjust our pitch in hundredths of a semitone called cents. This control is often referred to as the fine pitch control, while this one is the coarse pitch control. So if I move the fine pitch control of oscillator 1 to plus 100 cents, and the coarse pitch control of oscillator 2 to plus 1 semitone, they should both be playing the same frequency. So why does any of this matter? Why don't I just draw the MIDI notes I want or simply play them on a keyboard? Well, you can, but that can be limiting. Let's see some examples. One common use of fine pitch control is to have identical oscillators but detune them, which means make the fine pitch different between them. This can make the sound seem bigger because we now hear that there are two sounds instead of one. If I have two identical oscillators playing at the same time with the same phase, it may be louder, but we won't notice that there is more than one oscillator playing. Detune one or both of them, and now we hear the difference between them. If we detune them a lot, the sound becomes dissonant and unsettling. Now, what if we want 12 detuned oscillators for an even bigger sound? Do I have to have 4 different tracks with Vital open and manually detune every oscillator? Fortunately, most modern synthesizers give you the option of adding voices. Think about voices as duplicate oscillators. Once again, we won't notice them until something about them changes. So we can add detune here. By default, Vital has 20% detune, which is quite a lot. Vital also starts with 100% phase randomization, meaning the phase of each voice could start anywhere in the waveform cycle. So if I have 0% detune and 0% phase randomization, the voices are identical, and the only difference between one voice and 16 is amplitude. But if I add detune, we now hear the different voices. If I add back in phase randomization, the different voices don't start all at the same point of their cycle, so it sounds more even, and the beginning of the note isn't as loud and pointed sounding. Now we have a big choir of oscillators instead of just one. A saw wave with several detuned voices is often called a supersaw, and it's a common sound in electronic dance music. But what if I want this sound to be even bigger? Let's add another oscillator playing the same sound an octave higher. I repeat all the steps from before, adding voices, adding or reducing detune, and now on the coarse pitch control, I add 12 steps, also known as 1 octave. Now what if I want it to sound more dissonant and unsettling? I can raise the detune. Or I can change the fine pitch of one of my oscillators. Let's offset oscillator 1 by 10 cents. Now each oscillator has 12 voices detuned from each other, and my two oscillators are further detuned from one another. If I only use a few voices with subtle detune, I can make a digital synthesizer sound more analog, since analog synths aren't as precise as digital synths. Notice how more detune adds faster movement to the sound. Now, if I lower these two oscillators 2 octaves, then go to the effects page and add the compressor, I get something very close to the bass synth from 1901 by Phoenix. I'll explain what the compressor does later. For now, just know that it's changing the amplitude of different frequencies based on their previous amplitude. Now let's listen to the difference adding detuned voices makes to some of the presets from my preset pack called Sounds You Know. A link for that's in the description. Another way we can play with pitch is by adding vibrato. Vibrato is subtle wavering of the pitch that you often hear when singers sustain a note, especially opera singers and grandma at church. It sounds great in synthesizers as well. So how do we do that? We do that by oscillating our fine pitch up and down. And how do we do that? We do that by using low frequency oscillators, also known as LFOs. Remember in the first video when we talked about how synthesizers have 3 tools: generators, modulators, and effects? An LFO is another example of a modulator. It doesn't make sound, even though it's an oscillator. It's used to oscillate a parameter of a generator, effect, or even another modulator. They're called low-frequency oscillators because most of the time they oscillate at a low frequency. It's usually so low of a frequency that you wouldn't even hear it even if it was generating sound. Remember when we talked about measuring frequency in hertz? Hertz means cycles or oscillations per second. This oscillator's frequency is so low it's measured with different units. By default, it oscillates once per half note. We can turn up the frequency to different tempo values or change the unit to seconds. We can even set the frequency the same way we set frequency of the oscillators in our generators, based on the note that we play. But regardless of how high the frequency is, this is still called a low-frequency oscillator. So to oscillate fine pitch and vital, simply drag this low-frequency oscillator to fine pitch. Now you'll hear the oscillator start at the original pitch, go up, and then come back down. But what if we want the pitch to go above and below the original pitch? If I right-click this modulation here, I can choose Make Bipolar. Now the original pitch is represented by the midpoint, right here instead of at the bottom. Now the pitch will start below the original pitch, then go above it, back down, and repeat. You might not hear much of a difference until I turn up the amount of pitch modulation. Now to adjust the amount, I click and drag this little circle up. I can also right-click it and enter a specific value. Now hear the difference between bipolar and unipolar. If I want this to be subtle, I can turn it down by clicking and dragging the mouse down. If I want the vibrato to be independent of my tempo, I can change the unit to seconds. This way, the sound will always have the same vibrato frequency regardless of the tempo of my track. I usually set vibrato somewhere between 0.1 and 0.3 seconds, but let's push this to the extreme. What if instead of modulating fine pitch, I modulate coarse pitch? And what if instead of measuring the frequency by seconds of our LFO, what if I measure it based on the frequency of my oscillators? First, let's remove the modulation of fine pitch by right-clicking this and clicking Remove. Now let's drag LFO1 to coarse pitch of oscillator 1. Now we get this laser sound. Now if I click on Units and choose Key Track, now my LFO's frequency is based on the frequency of whatever note I play. So by default, it's 1 octave below the note I play, or -12 semitones. Now the pitch of our oscillator is being modulated so far and so frequently, it's creating additional audible pitches. This is a technique called frequency modulation. The only difference between the vibrato that we did earlier and this technique is the amplitude and frequency of our modulator. The amplitude of our modulator is controlled here and the frequency is controlled here. Don't worry if this doesn't make complete sense. Frequency modulation is a deep topic, and I'll make an entire video on how you can use it to make all sorts of unique sounds. So let's recap. So far we've talked about frequency. In the context of a waveform, frequency refers to the number of oscillations within a given time frame. Hertz is the number of oscillations per second. We can also refer to frequency as pitch. In music, we refer to pitches with note names and sometimes give a number to refer to the octave. For example, D sharp 5 is an octave higher than D sharp 4. Octaves occur when a frequency is doubled or halved. Each octave is broken up into 12 semitones controlled by the coarse pitch control. Each semitone is broken up into 100 cents controlled by the fine pitch control. We can add vibrato to an oscillator by modulating fine pitch with an LFO, also known as a low-frequency oscillator. Remember when I showed you what an octave was by using this thing? Notice how moving this thing up adds another oscillation to the waveform. In other words, this adds the frequency of whatever note I play to itself. So if the frequency of the note I play is 100 Hz, then this frequency would be 200 Hz. This one would be 300 Hz, and so on. So 100 Hz and 200 Hz are the same note an octave apart, but 300 Hz is a different note because it's not double 100 or 200. Let's use pitches instead of Hertz. If this is C3, then this pitch is C4. Both are Cs. But this pitch is G4. If we continue upward, we'll get many more pitches. So why do we care about this pattern? Well, this pattern, known as the Harmonic Series, is found in almost every resonant sound, especially synthesized sounds. For example, let's take a look at the basic shapes wavetable in Vital. The first basic shape is a sine wave, which only has one pitch. If I play a note, I can click on the Advanced tab and see a spectral analyzer. Here the x-axis represents frequency and the y-axis represents amplitude. You can see one spike representing the sine wave that I'm playing. Now if I go back to the Voice tab and move this slider up to the sawtooth shape, then go back to the Advanced tab and play a note, you'll see several spikes in the spectral analyzer. Each one of these frequencies is from the Harmonic Series. These frequencies are referred to as partials, or sometimes as harmonics, and the first spike is referred to as the fundamental. So just like before, if the fundamental is at 100 Hz, this one is 200 Hz, and this one is 300 Hz, and so on. Most of the time in synthesis, we create our sounds by decreasing the amplitude of frequencies from a sound like this one, or by adding harmonics to a simple shape like the sine wave from before. The process of removing or turning down the amplitude of the different frequencies of a sound is called subtractive synthesis. You can think of this process like a sculptor chipping away at marble until the work of art reveals itself. The other process of adding different frequencies to a sound is called additive synthesis. You can think of this process more like painting. Every part of a painting has to be added to the canvas. Now let's talk about our oscillators. This thing that I've been using here is called a wavetable, and I'm using the basic shapes wavetable found in the factory folder here. You can get a better idea of what a wavetable is by seeing the 3D view. This controls the shape of our waveform, and that shape determines the amplitude of the harmonics in our sound. I can scroll through different shapes of the wavetable with this. The first shape is called a sine wave, and it has no harmonics, just the fundamental. If I move up to the sawtooth wave, sometimes just called a saw wave, we get every harmonic of the note we play. The square wave has all the odd-ordered harmonics of our fundamental, such as the third harmonic, fifth harmonic, seventh, and so on. We can see and edit the amplitude of these harmonics in the wavetable editor by clicking this pencil icon. These diamonds are keyframes of the wavetable. We can see the waveform at each keyframe by clicking them. Here's the sine, here's the sawtooth, and here's the square. This window here shows us the amplitude of the harmonics of the selected keyframe. So if we look at the keyframe with the sine wave, we see the fundamental. The saw wave has every harmonic, and the square wave has only the odd-ordered harmonics. Then there's the triangle wave, which also only has odd-ordered harmonics, but unlike the square wave, the amplitude of those harmonics decreases the higher they are. You can zoom in and out horizontally with your mouse's scroll wheel. From this view, we can also edit the amplitude of any harmonic by clicking and dragging. This gives us fine-grained control over our sound. I'll talk more about what's possible with the wavetable editor in another video. For now, I highly recommend playing with these 4 basic shapes: sine, triangle, saw, and square waves. Try playing them in the low register by turning down coarse pitch. Try playing them in the upper register by raising coarse pitch. Get to know how differently they sound. They're going to be the building blocks for the majority of the sounds we create. Almost every sound I've created in my videos started with either the basic shapes or a sample. The sine wave is the darkest since it has no harmonics. The triangle is a little brighter, but not as bright as the saw and square waves. The saw and square waves are the brightest. The aesthetic difference between a saw wave and a square wave is hard to put into words, but the best description I've heard for a square wave is hollow. Square waves might also be reminiscent of 8-bit music from the video games of the 1980s. Now to recap part 2 of this video, we talked about the Harmonic Series. The Harmonic Series is a pattern found in resonant sounds of nature and in many synthesized sounds as well. Each of the basic shapes has different patterns of harmonics. A sine wave has no harmonics. A saw wave has all the harmonics. Square waves and triangle waves only have odd-ordered harmonics, and the triangle waves' harmonics decrease in amplitude as they get higher. Once you can reliably tell the difference between the basic shapes, I highly recommend this game to challenge yourself to recognize the Harmonic Series. So what I did is I loaded up a sine wave from basic shapes found under factory. Now I'm going to go to the wavetable editor here. So remember, a sine wave is just the fundamental. There are no harmonics. So I'm going to play an F. I'm going to play it down an octave. So what I'm hearing is this spike right here. Now, if I click somewhere above it, I can add another spike. So that spike is the third harmonic. Since this is first, this is second, and this is third. And now you hear that extra frequency added to the sound. So my challenge here is I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to click a random spot. And then the challenge is to recognize the number of that harmonic or that partial by ear. So let's see how I do. Okay, that's really high up. I'm hearing that as being the 19th harmonic. So 1, 2, 3, oops. 1, 2.
A few minutes later.
16, 17, 18, 19. The note for this partial, since I'm playing an F down here, this is an A flat. And that's how I'm able to do that. Because I've memorized the notes of the different harmonics, and I can transpose them based on whatever note I'm playing. So let's do one more, and then I'll show you another game we can play. So that's an octave. It's the same note. I'm playing an F, and this is also an F. So this is actually kind of challenging because there are multiple octaves in the harmonic series. So I think that's the, it's either the 8th one or it's the 16th one. I think that's the 16th one. Let's see, 1, 2, 3.
A few moments later.
14, 15, 16. So it's going to be a little bit hard to predict how far up you go. You know, if I click somewhere way up here, you know, I'm not going to be able to know what that is. Shoot for knowing the first 16 harmonics eventually. If you know the first 16 harmonics and you can recognize them, you're in a very good position. It's pretty rare that I'm hearing a sound and I'm recognizing harmonics sticking out above the 16th harmonic. It just doesn't happen that much. In fact, if you're just recognizing the first 8 harmonics, that's really good. And that's going to help you a lot for sound design. So let's learn a different game now. So here's an advanced level game that will challenge your knowledge of the harmonic series. So the previous challenge was challenging enough, but in that challenge, we were generating the partials with the synthesizer and then seeing if we could recognize which partials they were. In this challenge, we're going to generate those partials ourselves by either singing or whistling. Now, keep in mind, it really doesn't matter how you sound. I mean, I'm a terrible singer, but I'm doing this anyways. As long as you can get close to the frequency that you're hearing in your head, this is a beneficial exercise. And you can whistle, you can do whatever you need to do to get that sound out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use oscillator 1 as a reference, and I'm going to sing along with it. I'm going to use oscillator 2 as a goal. So I'm going to set this up just to be a little bit easier so that I can hear myself when I'm singing, but still hear the reference. So just follow along with these steps. It doesn't matter if you understand what I'm doing. So for oscillator 1, I'm going to click on these 3 dashes here and add in a low pass filter. I'm going to right click on this dial here and click enter value, then type in 30 and hit return. Now for oscillator 2, open this up with this little dot right here and then click on init. I'm going to go select the Harmonic Series wavetable under factory. Now once I'm here, I'm going to click on this pencil icon where it says waveform blend. I'm going to click none, then click on this X here. And now I can snap between partials of the harmonic series by moving this slider up. So you could check yourself along the way with each partial as you're singing them. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set a goal with this. So I want to sing the first 8 partials of the harmonic series. So I'm going to set this to the 8th partial. I'm going to sing with it muted. Then when I think I'm on the 8th partial, I'll unmute it and I'll compare. So what I'm going to do is move this up to the 8th partial, which I believe is at about 120, 122-ish. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I have 8 of these cycles. I know I'm at the 8th partial. So I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to play a note, and it's going to play oscillator 1, and then I'm going to start singing along, starting with the second partial. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it was pretty good. It was pretty close, a little out of tune, but at least I'm singing the right number of notes to get all the way up to that 8th partial. And I highly recommend this exercise if you want to challenge yourself, challenge your knowledge of the Harmonic Series, because knowing the Harmonic Series really well will help you immensely as a sound designer. So that concludes part 2 of the tutorial series all about frequency. So take your time digesting this material. It's a lot to take in, I know, especially when it comes to recognizing the differences between the different waveforms, the basic shapes, including sine, triangle, saw, and square. And it takes a long time to familiarize yourself with the Harmonic Series. And I highly recommend doing that because it's going to help you a lot as a sound designer. Then in the next video, we're going to combine what we've learned about amplitude and frequency, and we're going to start manipulating those variables using the Vital synthesizer in order to create all sorts of new sounds. So I'll see you there. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.